Welcome to the AI Standard Stack with me, Michael Mainelli, Director at Zien Group.
And me, Adam Smith, Chair of the AIQI Consortium.
Each episode on AI Standards Stack, we discuss developments in AI assurance with guests from around the world that are leading the charge on the standards, ethics, and regulation of AI. This episode of the AI Standards Stack is supported by the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, UKAS, the UK's national accreditation body. UKAS ensures organizations that test, inspect, and certify AI systems are technically competent, impartial, and robust, building confidence in safe, reliable, and trustworthy AI.
On the show today, we're joined by Mike Thieme, Managing Director and Cloud Advisory Lead at Accenture. Mike previously worked as the CTO and Senior VP of No Better Solutions before its acquisition by Accenture Federal Services in 2021. He leads the development of cutting-edge AI capabilities for public sector clients, focusing on responsible, trustworthy design and real-world impact.
Well, welcome to the show, Mike. It's really a pleasure to have you on. And just before we kind of unpack the stack, could you say a few words about how you got to where you are and why the thrilling and exciting world of AI standards is vital to your fulfillment in life?
Thank you. I really appreciate being part of this, and thanks for having me. So, how do I get here? How did I get here? Answering purely from a standards point of view, my first entry point into the standards community was well before we had AI standards. This is in the biometrics space, right? And so, imagine a guy at a startup who wants to sort of make his name in a technical field. So circa 2005, I got involved in biometric standards, things like how do you tell that a fingerprint is fake, and how do you measure or not whether a fingerprint actually matches, right? And so fast forward over the years, as AI started to emerge and become standardized, it was a reasonably easy mapping of skills from the biometric space to the AI space. And since my day job was doing AI full time, delivering for clients, it was kind of a logical transition to get involved in the standardization space as well. So that's how I got here. And as we talk today, I'm sure that more vignettes will come out as far as how I got to where I am. But either way, that's the abbreviated version of my story. So yeah.
And in the sense of the listeners, given quite a bit of experience and also at the cutting edge of doing stuff, could you give us what message? What's the one big lesson you've learned? We'll come back to it at the end, but I'd be curious what you think this audience ought to pick up.
Right. So I think the one thing that I might be able to bring that is a little bit differentiated is that um, when I am engaged in the standards work, I am fully engaged. And then when I'm not, I'm completely not. So I'm able to look at this, I think, with a very much of an independent eye, right, as a bit of a third party. And I think the main message is about consumability, right? How does somebody who is extremely busy in their day job, who has 3 minutes a week to think about how standards might impact them, how do we give them actionable steps, processes, mechanisms, tools to be able to make the best use of time? I think sometimes as folks who there might be folks who live and breathe this who might have their full attention dedicated. So be mindful of the consumability of our outputs, I think, is the main message. So hopefully, as we talk through the topics today, we can focus on examples where we've had to sort of bring that to the foreground. So, yeah.
Now, you mentioned that you were, so close to the sector coming from biometrics, and you were clearly, I think I know, using various tools and techniques on pattern recognition, images, predictive analytics sort of stuff. But could you give the listeners just a quick clue as to, what it was like to get your fingernails dirty at that time as opposed to the generative AI LLM period?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked because, we in the biometric space, I feel like we were not by design, but almost by accident, like at the vanguard of when Gen AI came to being. And so one of the most interesting sort of mission applications I had in biometrics was developing, let's just call them synthetic face images, right? That's a diplomatic way to put it, right? Synthetic face images for lots of different use cases that you might be able to imagine, right? So I sound like an old person, but back in the old days, right, we were using, pretty brute force machine learning techniques to essentially reverse engineer pattern matching algorithms to develop little textures you might embed into a face, right? Not using the sort of holistic view and holistic models of face. And so we had this work, and this stuff came out from NVIDIA. This is, several years ago, that was automating the ability to, essentially adversarially generate these kinds of faces. And this was in the midst of our delivery, and we had to transition from old school to new school generative techniques right in midstream as they are emerging, literally taking libraries off the repos like as they came out day by day, right? And I do think that the first sort of mainstream physical application of Gen AI was actually in the biometric and the face recognition space. That's where it proved its sort of mettle. And then, text and everything came later, but that's kind of how I lived it, right? And so as a delivery team, we had to think about the transition from traditional to generative models and deal with like the way that they came to market, which is very different than how the traditional stuff is available. So a lot in there, but that's kind of how kind of how I lived through that process. So I'll stop there.
That's really interesting, and biometrics is a really interesting space because you look at that space and you see validation data sets being held out by test labs in a way that you don't see with other types of AI. So I think
Right.
biometrics is a little bit, it leads the way a little bit, not just in standards, but in the whole metrology side of things as well.
That's a good way to think about it. Yeah, a lot of the way that we think about measuring AI systems, it's not one to one, right? Because the trade space is different, but a lot of really groundbreaking work was done in performance measurement in the biometric space for the exact reason you described, Adam, that the some of the forefathers and foremothers of the space had the foresight to think about withholding data sets and standing up really rigorous test regimes that advance the industry, right? Both open source and proprietary tools. And so you're right, the biometric space, I think, provides a model for how we can think about the best way to test accuracy and test performance for like these other emerging techniques that might be in multimodal or in text data or spaces like that. So it's a great observation.
Now, one other thing about your experience is that you've actually worked in both the private and the public sectors. You've done extensively work in deploying AI in federal governments, and I'm assuming a lot of the biometric work was done with private firms, but perhaps on federal contracts.
Right there, it was all kind of a mixture. The preponderance of the work was in the federal space, but when you're in that space, you're inevitably working with vendors, and there's a lot of bleed over into commercial applications. Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
that's definitely true. Yep.
Now, there's been, many sectors in many areas, just forget AI, it could be food safety or something. Governments tend to think it's for everybody else and not for them. So how effective is governance approaches and standards approaches within the government environment?
Yeah, it's a very complicated and like multi-dimensional question. What I will say, is the challenge that we faced, and I think this is the last year or so, it's a very different landscape. But if we rewind to the sort of emergence of Gen AI, it is natural for government acquisition authorities to be very cautious, right? The tools have to go through rigorous security and safety and compliance regimes, which might at the time seem very frustrating. Like, why can't I just download and use this thing that's really cool and awesome? The reason being is that, the government has an interest in ensuring that the supply chain is secure and, reconciling the supply chain validation rigidity with the extraordinarily rapid emergence of tools. That's a very hard thing to reconcile, right? And I feel like how to say it, it was beneficial, I think, that the government was slow to adopt some of these capabilities because we've seen, I think, some of the really challenging supply chain uses that we've had. I think we've seen some of the adversarial uses of AI, and so I think at the time we might have been frustrated that the government couldn't move faster and couldn't authorize things faster. But there was a bit of a method to the madness there. I do think right now where we are is I think we've struck a good balance of expedient like authorization and ability to use AI tools in these spaces without being so rash as using stuff that hasn't been vetted. But it is a really dynamic space. And my last thought here, and this is, uh, maybe to reflect on the biggest difference between my initial experience and the way things are now, is that like the rapid and like almost universal availability of tools on almost a day by day basis is something that we never had to think about before. Like we thought about tooling as something that would change over the course of like several months, like back when we were working with these tools in government agencies. And now that cycle has gone from months to weeks, almost down to days, right? And that is a big thing to reconcile in the government space. So a lot to unpack there, but that would be my macro level observation.
Well, that's really helpful. I know there are a lot of issues, but it sounds like
Yeah.
you're feeling it's nice. I'm just optimistic here. You're feeling that there is a balance
It's a
and
bet.
maybe
There's a better
balancing.
balance than there was. Yeah, I think there's a realization that the prior regimes cannot be reconciled with the way the tools are coming out. But by the same token, it's inappropriate to just like download and run the coolest new thing because it's there. And so I think finding that middle ground is that's what those auditability regimes are there for. So yeah.
And just a quick one for our listeners. Obviously, you're heavily involved in the ISO standards with Adam and all, but do you have international experience or is most of your experience US based?
It's right. My work with Adam is sort of at the ISO level and through SC42, where it's artificial intelligence. But in order to do that work, we might all know, but at least at the US level, we have to execute our responsibilities within ANSI, right? So there's kind of a mirror set of responsibilities that are run domestically in the US. Luckily, the vast majority of the work that we do in the US at the ANSI level is designed to mirror and empower our work in ISO, meaning that we're not developing a set of like shadow standards in the United States that are going to, diverge from the ISO theme. We've sort of taken the approach that ISO has a set of great technical experts with a lot of capabilities who are leading the way, and we should cast our lot with that group of standards is the best way to put it, right? And so, yeah, I'll stop there. I think that's the best way to think about it. So, yeah,
Okay. We might come back to the ANSI international borders and what's happening. But
yeah.
before we do that, it might help our audience. You've led and participated in multiple AI standards developments projects, and I understand most of them are quite technical. But can you tell us a bit more about those projects and why they interested you, and maybe what was achieved?
Yeah, I'll tell you about a couple, and it's why before we started chatting, I actually brought up a couple of different screens because like the titles of these sometimes change, and sometimes it's better for me to read things out. And so if you're like, why is he reading the screen? It's because like the wording gets so intense. But so with Adam, we've had the good fortune to spend the last, I guess, couple years now collaborating on the progression of a standard in verification and validation. So we're part of a joint working group on AI software testing. So one of the projects that I help to lead is called Artificial Intelligence Testing of AI, Verification and Validation Analysis of AI Systems. And the genesis of this work was that,
I can see why you need to read
yeah,
those sorts of things
exactly, right.
out.
Who even cares? But like V&V, V&V is one of those, North stars for the way that people think about software testing. And there's an entire like philosophy and there's a centrality of like a V&V the way that people think about things, right? And there was a gap in the landscape around V&V analysis that needed to be closed off. And I inherited this work, I think maybe 2 years ago from a project editor who didn't have the time to work on it. And so I jumped in and said, well, this is something we can advance. And so with Adam, leading that joint working group, we're able to identify sort of existing mechanisms that we could bring into the V&V landscape to avoid sort of like reinventing the wheel. And so I think it was a really good initiative to help bring and reconcile work in SE42 on things like testing and quality assurance, bring it within sort of that software testing regime and sort of square that circle. And that's part of a multi-part standard. It'll wind up having, I think, Adam, it might be up to maybe 8 parts right now. So it plugs into
Mhm.
a larger ecosystem of testing approaches that an organization can sort of choose from that sort of best fits their needs. So that's the first piece. And Adam, if you wanted to weigh in there at all to paint a bigger picture of that series, you can before I jump into the other one. So I'll stop there for a moment.
Yeah, I think the bigger picture is that the systems and software community and standardization, which has a long history of producing ISO IEC standards, has set up a whole series of processes around software and system testing and software quality. And one of the things we've done in SC42 is to try and build on that and to look at, what is the difference in the quality model with an AI system? What are the differences in the different testing approaches, and try to unite and align with that existing body of work. But equally in AI, everything is new. So what some people would call testing, they call evals if they're data scientists, or adversarial red teamers and things like that. So working through some of those differences has been fascinating and is an ongoing project. And thanks for your contribution, Mike, with this part, which should be published this year, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, we're very close, right? And yeah, it's been eye-opening. I think the macro lesson here, and I'm thinking coming back to my theme about like if someone just had 3 minutes to think about this, right? If you just have 3 minutes a day, like you expect that these questions of like what's an evaluation versus what's an assessment versus what's a test, like you just need that to be answered for you, right? And so, Adam is leading a multifaceted initiative to try to get alignment on that sort of basics, that basic view of the way that we're going to be assessing AI to be able to make it actionable for decision makers. So a lot of work is done behind the scenes to synthesize these different viewpoints and to bring them together. So it's very challenging. The other piece that I spend most of my time on, and Adam, you'll be glad to know that I plan to block my calendar tonight to get this thing ready for its next, literally ready for its next voting cycle. I've cleared out my Thursday night here in London, but it's in the area of performance evaluation. Performance measurement actually is the right word. Performance measurement for AI classification, regression, clustering, and recommendation. So if you think about all the things that AI does that is maybe not generative AI, like all the traditional things that you do with AI that you see presented to you hundreds of times a day, like AI recommendation systems that are operating like right now on every tab I have in Chrome. There's some AI recommender is doing things for me, right? And there's some AI clustering tool that's working behind the scenes to essentially to understand what kind of profile I am. Each of those areas has several different ways of measuring effectiveness, measuring outputs, measuring accuracy, and the community needed an integrated, consolidated, and consistent way of expressing performance in all these domains. It's stuff that has been, in some cases, sorted and understood years ago, but never written down in a standardized way. There's other ways that are kind of even now, right now, we're emerging, right? New ways of measuring and assessing this space. But what this standard is going to do is to basically put it all into one consistently presented umbrella so that if somebody asks, how can I tell how well my classification tool is working? How can I tell who to go to for a given clustering algorithm? This will be essentially a one-stop shop for all of those metrics and all those methods. And it doesn't, importantly, it doesn't only pick one method, right? It gives us a variety of different methods you can use depending on your use case, depending on whether you're more concerned with precision versus recall, depending on whether you're driven by cost savings versus, depth of analysis. But this has been a long time coming. And we're at the point right now of having a stable document with a lot of great technical material that is going to be ready for as a reference point for consumers. So I'll stop there.
Well, actually, I'll pull you on that if I may.
Yeah.
It's absolutely very interesting. We had a project over here some 3 years ago called StatLog. I don't know if you ever came across that. That was led by David Spiegelhalter at Cambridge. It was actually an EU project, and we took 20 different classification methods and something like 22 or 3 different data sets. So heart disease, credit scoring, image recognition, and just ran batteries of tests and found that the metrics were really difficult. I'm currently in a project which is text-based, and we are desperately trying to figure out the metrics in this area for an application to do with quality of qualitative answers. So it's
Mhm.
really a nightmare. Um, and you clearly think that reproducible and repeatable measurements are important, and they're important for AI governance. But what are the implications if you got to an area where the AI seems to be doing good stuff, but you just are really unable to get a handle on a solid metric? What does that imply?
Yeah, it's a challenging thing to think through, right? If your results aren't reproducible and they're not deterministic, then like like what do we as evaluators do, right? How do we approach that space? And I think we need to be comfortable with, more shades of gray in assessing the outputs of these algorithms, right? Like it's clear that an algorithmic output that is like factually incorrect, that represents completely inaccurate data, like that goes into one sort of class where one sort of like assessment class where clearly this is an unacceptable response, right? But the sophistication of the tooling that we're using now does allow for responses that are, weak but usable, right? That are, defensible but, not perfect. And so learning to, adjudicate responses with on a continuum, right? And I think that's something that we as a community are going to have to deal with and sort of like be able to accommodate, right? One way to think about it is that we know now that the tooling that we're using in AI essentially, can be, calibrated, for lack of a better to put it, can be utilized in a way that like, literally will give you more useful, more accurate, more fulsome answers as long as you're willing to, turn the dial up and use more tokens, right? So I think our ability to assess these tools needs to be mindful of those kind of trade-offs. I do think that this idea of having like trade-offs built into your assessment like regimes is not new. Like we've been doing that for a long time. Like we've been for quite a while trading off elements of accuracy. We've been trading off elements of what we would call in the old days false positives, false negatives, right? Of those sort of depths of searches. And so I think it's just applying that same sort of mindset into this space is what's necessary. But it is it is very complicated. It's very dynamic, and I think that we as testers need to meet the industry where it is, right, and not try to make it fit into maybe previous regimes that we're not built for it. So I'll stop there.
One of the most important things about these standards that define metrics for evaluating correctness is the huge amount of downstream value, because then standards that look at things like bias and robustness can build upon those metrics, and claims about AI systems or products can be conformity assessed. If you consumer groups sometimes talk about getting better information to consumers about the different aspects of a system. And without really defining the measures in a reproducible way, it's hard to have any kind of credible ecosystem around those claims.
Yeah, and that Adam, that's a great way to think about it. If you think about right now, the public's experience of AI is, maybe asking open-ended, multifaceted questions of these models, right? And these models give back multidimensional responses, but like those responses can oftentimes be decomposed, right, into different like sub-assertions, and that decomposition, like those can be looked at in a probably kind of a granular way, right? Like there might
Yeah.
be 11 elements of their response, of which seven actually can be assessed through these methods that we're developing. And there might be four that are more completely open-ended and subjective. But you're right, Adam, that decomposition is what's necessary there. And we think about
Mm.
reproducibility, it might be that, elements of AI system interactions are going to be reproducible, and we'll put those there. We'll measure them in a certain way, and others aren't. But we as a community need to be ready to like meet the models where they are and to be able to like work with them and work with their outputs in the way they are and I will say, in order for our work to be like usable by the wider community, like we need to like there needs to be that like adaptability in the approaches that we're bringing to bear. So yeah, I'll stop
Mm.
there.
And one interesting thing is there's separate measurement standards underway for sort of text problems like you were alluding to, Michael. We've got a joint project with the linguistic standardization community looking at methods for evaluating text. And we've got a similar initiative underway in Europe around computer vision. So there's a huge amount of work to get standards like this in place, covering all sorts of different AI systems.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is very dynamic. Yeah, Adam, to your point, yeah, it's a lot to keep up with. Yeah, a lot to boil down. If you're trying to present to your leadership on like the hows and whys, it's a lot to summarize. So yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Let's return to that border between ANSI and ISO, or between the US maybe and ISO. Um, uh, you said that ANSI's, positively following, what it learns from ISO, but are there actual points of fundamental difference? Are these different schools, or is it just the usual thing that you start nationally, you start discussing things internationally, and it bounces back and forth and slowly congeals?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak out of school here. I'm just a small element of the overall ecosystem, right? Like I work for Accenture. Accenture is part of, we represent up into ANSI, but Accenture itself has, this massive global footprint. So this is just one person's opinion, right? So I think that, we like fundamentally, we all have the same interest, right? We want to publish and propagate high quality standards that businesses can use, that governments can use, right? We all want the same outcome, right? And some of us, some stakeholders, like have a very strong business need that certain elements like get sorted very quickly, right? Like if you're a technology provider who's developing, certain types of models, then you have a very strong business interest to get to that like finish line as soon as possible. I think that from my vantage point, right, like what I would say is that I think the vast majority of people who I interact with, right, are really anchoring their decision making on tying it back to some type of clear and expressible business need, right? Like the standard needs to come back, it needs to be usable, it needs to be like valid in a business context, right? And so I think about the work that we do in the US, like when we think about, is it worth spending time on the standard? Is this something that we support and want to spend energy against? Everybody asks a fundamental question: can I go to my boss and justify the time I'm spending on this? Right? Or is it, and if yes, then we as a community want to get behind that. We'll have experts weigh in, we'll spend time on it. If it's something that is not relevant to our business leaders and our organizations, be it Accenture or a cloud provider or whomever, then we just won't spend time on it. And if the international community wants to, that's fine. So I think ANSI is like strongly aligned with things that are going to address a business need. And I'm sure for Adam, like when Adam knocks on my door and says like we need this publication out fairly soon, it's because there are stakeholders, right, with a strong business need who need to have these
Hmm.
publications up and ready and available, right? So working backward from business need, I think, is a great anchor for all of our activities, both at the ANSI and the ISO level. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to some other non-AI stuff in a minute, but you're at a cocktail party and there's an attractive person you're trying to chat up, and you open up and you say, "I'm involved in standards, AI standards."
Uh,
Uh, what's the chat up line that gets them to stay anywhere in your vicinity?
Well, I would probably never use like what I said before at the top of the call that like the by I'm able to sequester my standards work in a way that makes sense. So I am very judicious about when I bring it up. But like for those like you know the example that I give like to make this practical, right? Like it was an awesome privilege to be in the room. Like so I remember being in Italy, right? The meetings happened to be in Bologna, right? Where we were working through the specific language of what it meant for a biometric use case to be high risk, right? And we were tuning in those exact words, right? And what I would say is that it might sound boring, but dialing in the exact language that either classifies an application as high risk and therefore subject to these controls or not, like someone actually has to do that work and someone needs to dial in the wording correctly. So if you're the kind of person who loves precise language, right? And who really enjoys being able to express things very, very clearly, like that's the kind of person who I would take this to, right? If it's somebody who doesn't care a lot about precision and wording, I wouldn't bring it up. But like it is really gratifying to be able to work with a set of stakeholders across languages and to be able to dial in language that we can all nod to and say, yes, we've expressed that concept correctly and precisely and consumably, and we're doing right by the community. Like that is it sounds weird to say. It actually is really it's exciting and gratifying to be able to do that type of work. Just at a human level, it's awesome to be able to achieve those outcomes, right? So that's how I would phrase it. There's a lot of words there, but that's a theme I would build to, right? It's a gratifying experience to be able to dial in language in a way that's usable.
Good. Well, there's a bit of passion there. I might buy you a drink.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, just moving away directly from standards themselves, looking at the wider system of human interaction. I mean, human in the loop gets thrown around a lot. It's kind of the throwaway answer for things in the defense sector. Well, there'll always be a human in the loop. Um, I'd be curious, what does that mean in your experience? And is it really true that human oversight adds value in generative AI systems, or is it more of a bottleneck than a safeguard, or is it
Yeah,
even more of a fig leaf than a reality?
everyone brings their own truth to this, but I will, this is an area, and I'm not here to, pitch for Accenture. Accenture is a big company, and we can do well on our own, right? But what I think the way that Accenture has attempted to reframe this narrative not is to try to get away from the idea of human in the loop and to reposition the narrative as human in the lead, right? And like without just drinking the Kool-Aid of like, taking essential language, I think that's the way to think about it, right? That like there's a necessity for human leadership when we're thinking about like initiating autonomous systems, right? If we think about kicking off a multi-stage agentic process that's going to run in the background for 6 hours, that's going to invoke lots of different tooling, that's going to like run into different subsystems. It's going to invoke lots of sub-processes. Like that entire like mechanism is a human-led process, but the human is not going to be in the loop in the vast majority of those interactions, right? The human's going to expect that the system escalates to it certain decision points when it needs intervention. And so I think we need to think of it as not the human in the loop as a peer to a bunch of other AI systems, but the human as at the top of a hierarchical pyramid, initiating and adjudicating and authorizing decisions, right? And I think that's a good way to think about it. What does it mean for a human to lead a set of AI subsystems? And as a leader, you would ask yourself, and coming back to that 3-minute idea, right? As a leader, you need to know when to be left alone and when certain decisions have to be brought to you, right? And working through that trade space of when is it appropriate for like AI decisions and routing to be escalated to a human leader. I think that's a really good and useful way to think about it. So I'll stop there.
So on human on the loop, I prefer to talk about human oversight, which human in the loop is kind of one approach, just as having a human leader is one approach, Mike.
Yeah.
And for me, when I've worked on that topic in standards, it comes down to, what is the questions like what is the reversibility of any harm that may occur if a human doesn't intervene or doesn't approve outputs, and put some kind of framework around how you decide whether you have effectively retrospective oversight of a system, whether you have a more involved process. And I guess there's a new generation of this, which is a human-led process, which has got me thinking, Mike. But there's a lot of conversation about this topic in standards, but it's more focused around oversight with human in the loop being just one option.
Right. It's a good way to think about it. Yeah, human in the loop, I think, is we need to reinforce the primacy and the centrality of human judgment in all these processes, right? And it's unrealistic to think that a human is going to adjudicate every part of the subsystems, right? But oversight's a great way to think about it. Oversight or leadership or like final like authority is what's necessary here. But like it's a really fraught topic, and the standards community, I think one way to think about the role, as I've been working through this space, right? You know, we might all be frustrated that the standards process moves at its own pace, right? That even the fastest publication will take, 12 or 18 months to get out the door. But there's a real benefit to that slowness and to that. I'll use the word slow. So there's a benefit to that pace of development, which is that you can step back and you can like move away from the immediate noise of what happens in the news day to day. And you can ask yourself, like, what is the right way to situate the human in this process, right? In a way that's applying good judgment, that's applying like, a critical lens here. And so, that there's a method to the madness in how these processes take a long time, right? Because it allows us to be thoughtful and to position the human in the way that's most appropriate and not just be reactive to what we're seeing maybe in the most recent technical development. So,
Well, actually, that's probably a good place for me to throw in kind of my last question, which is, you've been in the field a long time, as have I, and we've seen the pace was very, very slow in terms of deployment. Then we've seen the immense enthusiasm by a lot of people, and then some of the frustration at the slow pace. But at the same time, we're seeing a huge proliferation that I don't think any of us anticipated. the speed at which it's happened over the last 3.5 years. So lots of generative and agentic AI getting more embedded in public services, private services, real decision making. So we're now seeing the leading edge of a lot of stuff that we've led on. Do you see any notable gaps between how AI is being deployed today and thoughts on good governance?
It is it is difficult to reconcile the perceived need to keep up with like what your competitors are doing. And if I work for a consultancy and I'm concerned that another consultancy is adopting tools more quickly and they're gaining efficiencies, or like reconciling that sense of like self-induced urgency with the need for like governance and pace. It is a very difficult challenge. And I think that the pendulum swings, right, where you have maybe periods where like the race to adoption like becomes a bit breakneck, and then the pendulum swings, and the public perception is that we need to move a bit more slowly. And I think like leadership needs to be able to have the belief in itself to swim against the current. If there's a time when the industry is racing to adopt and push out models very rapidly, and there's a race to embrace things quickly, as a leader, it's probably time to pull back and to err on the side of, caution and governance, and waiting out a cycle. It's okay to wait out a cycle because there'll always be a new one. And I think that's a good, if I think about, again, coming back to the theme of like presenting to leadership and the value of standards, I think the value here is to be able to take back a disciplined message to your leadership that is willing to have the courage to swim against the current tide, right? And in the best interest of a business that might have a bit of a longer term view. And I think standard supports that longer term view that's really necessary as a counterweight to the things that happen on a day-to-day basis. So a bit of a long answer, but I think that's how I view like the way you've queued up that question. So yeah.
Adam, any last comment from you?
Yeah. I wonder, Mike, and this is just asking you as an expert really here, where do you think standards might go next in terms of agentic AI?
Yeah, so I think what's most necessary, and this will be a boring answer, but I think it's evident to all of us that we lack the basic grounding in terminology, right? And one of the awesome things that standards can do is to get us to agree on some basic sets of terms. And once you agree on the terms, then you're 70% of the way there. Think back to the biometric community. My first real battle was defining, hey, what do you call a fake fingerprint, right? And it might sound like an easy question, but when you dig into it, it's actually very, very subtle. And so I think, Adam, just doing some basic blocking and tackling on terminology and interchange like language will actually help disambiguate and clarify what's happening here. And I know that work is happening in some different WGs, but that's the first step, right? Is language and terminology alignment, and then from there we can build out the infrastructure. So I'll stop there.
Well, that is a really powerful place to stop. I mean, I've picked up quite a bit today, so thank you. Interesting your point about the business-led standards, which in a way is self-policing in terms of effort, time spent, etc. Second thing is the point you just sort of ended on, the importance of actually having a defined vocabulary, a taxonomy for that vocabulary, and the precision that comes from that allows us to develop a better standard as well. I loved your comment on the measurability, where there are measures that are weak but usable, and that's a very important part. And finally, and I think for all of us in the standards community, the issue of, yeah, well, most people are doing this 3 minutes a day. So have you boiled this down to make it easy for them? Those are all very, very good points. So thank you, Mike, for sharing your valuable insights today. And thanks to my co-host, Adam Leon Smith. My thanks to all of you listening here on the show. And please join us the next time when we cover the full stack of AI standards, ethics, and regulation.